Look, today, what I'm going to be doing is talking about the CAMBI soil carbon pilot. This is something that started back in 2009. But before I sort of get into the details of the project and sort of why we developed it and some of the early results, I'll give a little bit of a background around some of the concepts around soil carbon and some of the data that sort of supports some of those concepts. And the aim of that is to sort of give everyone a background. It helps to understand sort of what's happening with some of the results that we're getting, and just to acknowledge this is a we're dealing with complex systems here. We're dealing with the soil. We're dealing with variable climates, variable soils, and then a management layer across the top of that. So there's plenty going on that we need to interpret when we're starting to look at soil carbon data. So I just wanted to start with this, which is around ERF projects. So that's emission reduction fund projects. So these are the projects that develop ACCUs for the federal government. And so there's been a real focus on this, particularly for soil carbon, for about 10 years. And up until sort of mid to late last year, there were very few soil carbon projects that were part of this. And there's sort of a number of reasons for that. We'd had 10 years in place, but we didn't have these projects. And so part of the reason for that is that there'd been quite a lot of monitoring going on, but obviously there were some technical issues and I guess the lack of evidence to support those projects coming online. That's sort of all changed middle of last year, where there were a number of quite large projects um, that were awarded, mainly in Queensland. And I guess I just wanted to highlight this because there's probably been a lot of media around this, and hopefully, once we go through sort of our results over 10 years, you'll get to see how sort of one point in time can often be, or change over one point in time can be difficult to interpret over the longer term. And even though there's sort of initial high gains, they might not be supported in the long run. So just wanted to go into some of the quick drivers, talk about the drivers of soil carbon. So one of the things that we did at the same time as we were developing this pilot is we had the National Soil Carbon Research Project. And that was looking at sampling a very large number of paddocks across Australia to determine what the actual soil carbon levels were. Um, Aaron and I were part of the Central New South Wales component of that project, where we did 400 paddocks from all the way from Bullagal in the west to sort of Oberon in the east. And so that helped to give us some really good understanding of what soil carbon levels there were in the paddocks and some of the drivers that are associated with those soil carbon levels. So there's two things here that I wanted to point. So this is looking at this graph here has the on the top panes is the average 30-year average rainfall, and then this is basically the carbon concentration. It's just log transformed on the y-axis over on this side. So what this shows is rainfall describes soil carbon, about half the variation in soil carbon in the top 10 centimetres. So if we go to any paddock and we know the rainfall, they'll give us about half. We can explain half the variability that we would see across those paddocks by just knowing the rainfall. As we go deeper in the soil, then that relationship is much weaker, and so by the time we get to 20 or 30 centimetres, it's not significant. The opposite sort of happens with some of our soil properties, and the soil property that I've got here down the bottom is silica, and that's associated with soil texture and also soil mineralogy. But you can see at the soil surface is a very weak relationship because most of that relationship is described by rainfall. And then that relationship becomes a bit stronger as we go deeper in the soil. But if we then say, okay, well, if we take that soil carbon and correct it for rainfall, and then here we've just got a subset of that original data that we're working with, and look at that silica again, but also look at the sand and the clay components of that soil. And so the dark, the solid dots at the top, that's the top 10 centimeters. And then we've got the grey circles are the 10 to 20, and then the light triangles are the 20 to 30. And so what we see here is that once we've taken that rainfall ground into account, we can then explain quite a lot of variability at depth with that soil texture. And so, as an example, this clay percentage explains about 60% of variation, and at the soil surface here, silica is the best one, and it explains about an extra 10. So, sorry, an extra 16%. So, what we come out with is somewhere in the order of 67% variation. And when we put both those variables in with a few other climate and topography variables, that's about the level of variation we can explain with those factors at the soil surface, and then at depth as well. So just to give you a bit of an idea of sort of the drivers. And really, what we're looking at here is the residual of these, which is then the management or some of the random influences about spatial variation and other things within the paddock as well. But that's really the management influence. It's a lot smaller, and it's generally less than 30% of the total variation in soil carbon can explain well management, and generally it's a much smaller component than that. So this is just another recap here, which is about what then drives the change in soil carbon, because this is really what we're interested in when we're looking at soil carbon projects to store carbon. We need to understand how much it's going to change. And there's two really important processes here that we need to understand. One is the inputs, which all come from plants and the growth of plants for organic carbon. And then the outputs, which is really driven by the microbial turnover. So the plant growth is a bit easier for us to see because we know when we've got lots of pasture in the paddock that's been grown. We also know when it hasn't happened. Microbial turnover is a lot harder for us to understand because it's a process that we can't see. And so, and it's always happening, even through quite dry periods, but there are spikes that can occur, particularly in moist and hot conditions. Variability is another major issue when we're looking at soil carbon, because one of the key things we have to do is to be able to measure the change that we see in soil carbon. So to do that, we have to have a well-designed sampling program that covers that variability, and then it gives us an indication of the error around those measurements. Then enables whether we've got a significant change, and is also linked into the ERF method for soil carbon. That variability, if it's high, then you get credited for a lower amount. But Aaron will talk a little bit more about that. So the reason I put this up, this is work done by Karnika Singh. It was out at Warren, but it's pretty typical of paddocks that we might see in the area that we're looking at. Here's the soil 0 to 10 soil carbon, and it can range anywhere from sort of somewhere around 10 at the lowest, 10 tons of soil carbon, up to somewhere around 30. So it's a big variation depending on where your core might land. And so when we look at a soil sampling method similar to what I'm going to be presenting in the pilot, we had about 10 samples with a 20-metre radius. Then that gives us a standard error of about 2.5 tonnes of soil carbon per hectare, which means that we significantly, at sort of 95%, we can only pick up a difference that's around 5 tonnes per hectare. So if you think about a tonne of carbon per hectare per year, which is a relatively large change, then we need at least 5 years of change before we could significantly pick up that change. So often when we're hearing about big changes over short periods of time, it's generally due to sampling error and around variation, measuring variation due to these longer term changes. This is actually some data from the Rothamsted long-term farming system trial, but it's just to illustrate a concept, which is basically we have this law of diminishing returns in sequestration. So if we have a starting point here, we implement a land management change. So in this case, it's the adding of manure, farmyard manure. You have a period where that builds up, but eventually it reaches a new equilibrium. Where if you don't change, then general the soil cover should basically stay the same. But if you build that up initially and then stop that management, then you have this period where it starts to decline again. And we sort of have this added issue in Australia of having a much more variable climate. So we've got a probably bigger seasonal influence that masks some of these longer term trends that we need to deal with as well. So that's sort of the end of the background, just to give you sort of a few of the key concepts around soil carbon before I sort of move on to the pilot. So the objective of the pilot, what we were looking at was it was really the first pilot of soil carbon sequestration in Australia. It was launched in July 2009. It was run by the New South Wales DPI, OEH, and what was the Lachlan Catchment Management Authority now, which is now obviously Separate Table and ZLS. And we wanted to answer this key question. This was before the Emission Reduction Fund had actually started and the CFI, Carbon Farming Initiative. So could we implement a soil carbon trading scheme if the government were to implement this policy? And so that sounds like a relatively simple question, but as I'll sort of demonstrate, we had to do a lot of groundwork to be able to design all components to make that sort of market-based instrument type project work. The first thing around that structure was there were three contract types. The first is an actions-based contract. So basically what that's saying is we worked out what the different soil carbon levels would be for different management practices on average. And a farmer would measure where they currently were. And then if they implemented a management practice that, say, was in line here, if we look at permanent pasture with tactical grazing, which is 44 tonnes, then they had a function that worked out the rate of change between where they currently were and that new equilibrium level. And they get paid on that regardless of what happened. The second approach was an outcomes-based contract, and that's where the farmer would measure the carbon at the beginning of the project. They'd put in basically a proposal to change that management, and we assess those based on the scientific potential of that carbon sequestration. And then we measured that again at the end of the 5-year period, and they were paid on the actual amount of sequestered. And then the hybrid contract is actually the half-half. So one of the key things that happened because of a lot of variability when we sort of started doing the initial monitoring across the whole Lachlan catchment, we really refined this into an area called the Cowra Trough, and that's why it was focused around Cowra, Canowindra, up as far as Manildra, and that's this little map here on the left. And then so that really narrowed down the soil type, which reduced some of the variation in soil properties, and also due to the climate. But even though we sort of had these levels that we were able to estimate for this region for different management practices, we also still had variation in soil texture, and we had to adjust those for that soil texture, and that was still quite a significant variation as well. So this is just a bit of an overview of the process we went through. So started in 2009, large soil sampling process and some modelling process and using existing data to work out what those equilibrium levels were. We also had some behavioural economics to work out the design of the MBI, which came up with those contract options that I showed you earlier. After that, we went into this tender phase, and a large part of that was engagement with producers in the area. And so I think initially we had in the order of 300 eligible farmers within that Cowra Trough area that could have taken part in the pilot. But we had initially 51 expressions of interest. So it was a really high level of engagement from producers in the area when we actually rolled out this pilot. Next thing after that engagement was this process where people submitted bids, and this is sort of after they were assessed whether they were eligible, and we did determine what potential soil carbon they could store. Then we had an appraisal process and contracting. Then we went into this implementation phase where we basically baselined all those properties at the beginning in 2012. And we went back to those properties in 2017 after 5 years, worked out what the change was in soil carbon, and then finalised the contracts for those producers. I guess because it was such a well baseline project, we had a lot of interest and still a lot of interest in the area, obviously, and really a lack of longitudinal data or data over time. We wanted to follow up on this, and this sort of happened. We went back and resampled those after another 5 years in 22. Um, we've re-engaged with the participants of those projects to sort of report that data back to them and also interpret what's going on with that. But we've also got this sort of component through this phase where we're wanting to build capacity and bring in the whole farm emissions. So we deliberately put that aside in the initial pilot because it's complex and we wanted to focus on the soil carbon. But now with sort of supply chains potentially coming on board to uh, develop sort of hopefully incentives for low emissions products, then that farm there's likely to be price differentials due to higher emitting and low emitting farms in the future. So we wanted to bring that context into the interpretation going forward. So there were 54 initial expressions of interest. So after we had those expressions of interest, we got a number of bids, and we developed. There was a large number of bids in the price per and the amount of sequestration that was potential. And so what we developed was a supply curve. So this is basically on the y-axis here. This is the dollars per ton of CO2e that the farmers tendered, and this is the amount of expected soil carbon sequestration that we had estimated. And then basically worked through this process where we just started with the lowest cost bids along this supply curve until we reached the amount of funding that we had available. And they were the successful bids. And there were 11 successful bids that were that we were able to select. And just this slide's just to show sort of what was driving a lot of the success of those bids. And so this is just the carbon percentage in the top 10 centimetres. So that those who applied and weren't able to go any further generally had a high soil carbon. And those who bid but weren't successful also had a bit lower soil carbon, but the successful projects were generally the ones that had the lowest soil carbon. And so that gave them a bit. So really it was targeting the areas where, and that was adjusted for soil texture as well. So it's really targeting the areas that had the lowest soil carbon and the highest potential to store soil carbon. So this is just a summary of the land management practices that were part of this. I'll leave this up as there's a lot of information on here, but so I won't go into a lot of detail. But basically, there were four main management types that were in place, and they were combinations of either organic amendments, which was mainly biosolids, or not, and perennial pasture versus improved cropping practice as the other, and it's the four combinations of those two things. So we had one site which basically improved cropping practice, and we sort of called that the reference site because it was just basically moving to sort of uh, GPS technology to play to sow between rows and stubble retention. So it was pretty much cropping as usual, but had a few minor tweaks to that system. And then this just basically shows those land management changes. So here we've got the pasture with organic amendments, pasture without, cropping without organic amendments, and then cropping with organic amendments. Aaron will break these sites up into some slightly different groups when he presents his information. So we actually had a fantastic result over this first 5 year periods. We estimated that we would have close to 7,000, I think it was 800 tonnes of CO2e over that period of time. We ended up storing nearly 10,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalents over the 748 hectares that were taking part in the pilot. So it was a really positive result, which gave us a lot of hope that sort of the process we'd gone through had helped to address some of these issues around identifying sites that had potential to store carbon. And this is just showing those groups that I had before. So organic amendments versus not, cropping versus perennial pasture. And this is the rates we predicted compared to the rates of sequestration that we actually monitored over that 5-year period. So just to point out that cropping, which we've called the reference site, there was a small decrease in the amount of carbon that had occurred over that period of time, where all the other sites or land management practices actually had a reasonable. So cropping, because some of that had organic amendments, was actually positive. Just perennial pasture was a big increase, and then organic amendments was not quite as large a difference, but still a big difference. So a little bit different to what we had predicted, and there's two reasons for that. The long-term data we used for the cropping was actually from some trials at Carra Research Station, where they had the conventional cultivation was 5 tillages over a summer period, where most farmers, we know from other surveys we've done, are doing somewhere in the order of 1.2 passes, including sowing. So we know that the level of disturbance in modern cropping systems is a lot less. Also, we probably most cropping systems, all you're doing when you're looking at a point in time is you've got a slower rate of decline with improved cropping practice, less so than an increase in carbon that occurs over that period of time. So other interesting things that we can do, we found some reasonable relationships between carbon in the top 10 centimetres and the soil carbon stock at 30 centimetres, which is really nice to help us be able to predict what soil carbon might be able to, or a lower cost way of predicting soil carbon stocks into the future. And then just finally, look, Aaron's going to go into this in a bit more detail, but he'll provide sort of some feedback around that analysis around how the different land management practices are impacted, and then if these projects were to be implemented as an ERF project, what the outcomes would have been. So just quickly, in summary, with the pilot demonstrated it was possible to use an NBI to pay farmers to change management to increase carbon. We over that first 5-year period, we sequestered sort of more than we predicted, so it was quite successful. And it was mainly due to identifying the participants with that low initial soil carbon that had a greater potential to sequester carbon. But we need to put this initial success into context of longer term sequestration and also with these whole farm emissions. And so with that, I will throw over to Aaron to pick up on the next phase of the project.
Sorry, can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So yeah, I'm going to go through and just talk about the results that we've gotten from those two sampling periods and talk about management and also climate, how they have potentially affected the observed soil organic carbon changes for the sites, and then also talk about the ACCU credit generation. So essentially, I'll just explain a little bit how the ERF method works and where people may have ended up if these sites had been an ERF project. So as Warwick said, there was good success in the first 5 years between 2012 and 2017. So this here is the average of all sites. So taking the average of all sites to give an idea of what's happening across the region. The soils are relatively uniform throughout the Carra Trough, which is why we used them. And it's not huge, but there is seasonal variability between sites. But you can see there that on average, the sites went up. There's actually quite a bit of variability between sites. Then when we went back and sampled in 2022, we got the results, and on average, the sites went back down. And really, after 10 years, there is no difference at many sites between the starting and the ending period. So even though sites sequestered carbon for those first 5 years, and we attributed that to management change, most of those sites losing carbon meant we need to have a bit of a rethink about this. So I guess what we've got here is we've demonstrated across 10 sites in a relatively small area that most of those sites lost soil organic carbon over a 10-year period. It's not the first time that this has been recorded. So this is some research that Warwick has published for the Condobolin Research Station. And this isn't soil carbon stocks, this is percentage of soil carbon, but a similar thing happened. It was just over a longer time frame, essentially. So each of these lines is a different treatment. So here we can see that, and I won't go through those treatments, but there's different cropping treatments as well as different pasture treatments in there and different rotations, and they all went up and they all came down. So there were some significant differences at different time points, but generally they all followed the same trend. So I'm going to reiterate some of the stuff that Warwick's gone through, just to, I guess, to hopefully reinforce it. So I see that there's a hierarchy of the drivers for soil organic carbon change. And without a doubt, the primary one is seasonal conditions. So when you look at the what drives soil organic carbon levels in a soil, when you have a lot of plant production, you're actually getting greater inputs into the soil, greater carbon inputs into the soil. But then when you go through a dry period and the microbes are still using that carbon as an energy source, they're actually respiring that and re-emitting that carbon back to the atmosphere. So it's very cyclical and it's really driven by seasonal conditions. The next one is soil type. So Warwick actually put up some graphs around this stuff. And soil type is definitely a driver of what happens with soil organic carbon at a site. So when that data that Warwick showed was a survey across a greater area, and it wasn't temperate, it was just at one point in time. But what we know is that a site that has a clay soil is going to respond differently to seasonal conditions to a site that has a sandy soil. So they'll have different capacities to store carbon, and they'll probably lose carbon at different rates depending on what's happening with the seasonal conditions. So I don't actually have any data to show that, but the dynamics are going to be driven by soil type. Then underpinning that, we actually have management. And so when you look at what happens for a paddock or for a site, you can actually use management to influence what's happening with that soil carbon, and hopefully you can do something that will sequester it. But really, the benefit or the outcome of that management change is going to be dependent on the interaction between soil type and seasonal conditions. So I can't remember what Warwick said, about 30% for that survey. What we really need to do is get a better handle on how effective management is, or the role of management and how much it contributes to the overall change compared to seasonal conditions and soil type. I guess the thing that's worth noting is that what we've done here is we've started creating a longer term soil carbon data set. And I was actually thinking while Warwick was talking, I think there's only 3 sites in Australia that have actually monitored soil organic carbon over longer periods, 2 down in Wagga and 1 up in Queensland. If there's people on here that will know better than me, if there's other ones there, put that in the chat. So I think we've actually only got, or 4, sorry, because we've got the Condo data set. So I think we've only got 4 data sets that have monitored soil organic carbon change under different management over a decent period of time. And so we're hoping that this will be a 5th one, and it'll give us a better understanding of long-term dynamics of soil organic carbon under different management strategies. There is limitations to using point-in-time data and trying to infer what might happen. I mean, we know that if you've got a relatively low soil organic carbon for a certain rainfall area and soil type, that you've got a greater chance or a greater capacity to sequester carbon. But just taking that point-in-time data doesn't actually tell us a lot about the dynamics between these 3 things: the seasonal conditions, soil type, and management. So what I did is I looked at the sites that we have data for, and I divided them into 3 management classes. The first was low input, so essentially conventional management but they're using relatively low rates of synthetic fertilisers and chemicals. I guess this was what I would say from when I was going around and getting samples in the early 2010s. It's the kind of approach that people were using during the millennium drought as a risk management strategy. But once the millennium drought broke, then people started using higher rates. So it's just, as an example, I guess it's when you're putting in a wheat crop, you might put on some MAP or DAP. You're not necessarily putting on urea. The other management class was what I called regenerative principles, and these are essentially producers that have embraced regenerative principles. They're using minimal or no inputs and chemicals. And then the third one was I classed as high input. And so that's essentially from a cropping perspective, you're not just putting on some MAP, you're also putting on urea and things like that to try and drive some yield changes. So I classified all those each site, and then I took the average for the different management classes, and that's what I'll present now. And so,
Aaron, just before you go on, there's a question about the continuity of management between the first phase and the second phase. You just want to briefly comment on that before you move on?
Okay. So that's actually a really good point. The reason that I have done, put them in these management classes is that some sites that were initially crop and put into pasture have since been, they're in a rotational system, have been put back into crop. And there was another site that was taken out of pasture, put into crop, and is now back in pasture again. So rather than trying to classify them as a crop site or a permanent pasture site, those kind of things, I tried to really look more at whether it was the high input, low input, or the kind of the regen approach. So yes, there have definitely been changes over time to some of those sites. So for the low input sites, what we saw was that they went up and down. So it followed that trend for the average. This was 4 sites that were classed as low input. And so they followed that. They followed that trend of increasing between 2012 and 2017, and then dropping again between 2017 and 2022. When we look at, it's not changing, when we look at the regenerative principle sites, and so this light coloured line here is just the low input site. When we look at the regenerative principle site, they have a very similar trend, almost like for like. Went up in the first 5 years, came down in the second 5 years. And then when we look at the high input sites, same trend. It went up between 2012 and 2017, and then went back down in between 2017 and 2022. But the increase and subsequent decrease wasn't as great as what occurred in the regen sites and the low input sites. So the other thing that I did was I classified them as having organic matter added or no organic matter added. So there were 4 sites that had biosolids added. So when you look at adding organic matter, adding biosolids or compost actually adds organic carbon to the soils. But the addition of that organic carbon, or the organic carbon that's added, would actually cycle relatively quickly. It's going to be labile carbon, so it's going to be used by the microbes as an energy source, and will be respired back to the atmosphere. I mean, some of it may move through into different pools, but most of it would be cycled relatively quickly. So we had a high degree of confidence that we weren't actually measuring the organic carbon that was in the biosolids when we went back after 5 years. But putting organic carbon into soils can actually result in this thing called negative priming. And essentially what that does is it increases soil carbon, but rather than priming the microbes to then chew through the carbon and respire it, it actually has the opposite effect. And so it slows down microbial decomposition of organic carbon or organic matter, and so it actually has a longer residence time in the soil. But when you actually compare the biosolids versus the no biosolids sites, there wasn't much of a difference. I think there's probably a greater, the slope for the biosolids sites was greater between 2017 and 2022 than for the no biosolids sites, which suggests that there may have been some carbon that, well, either residual carbon or the negative priming effect had occurred, and then that had been depleted by the soil microbes between 2017 and 2022. So I did say that most sites went up and went down, but there were two black sheep sites, as I call them. So these two sites started and had a similar trend. They went up in the first 5 years, and then the second site went down, but only very slightly, and the other site went up slightly in that second sampling period. Now, the interesting thing here is that the site that is shown by the blue line is a perennial pasture site that had very conservative grazing on it. And so it had high levels of biomass, good, excellent ground cover, maybe 100% ground cover nearly all the time. And they actually managed to maintain a decent amount of the small increase that they got in that first 5 year period. The second one, the red one, was the opposite. So the words used by the farmer when I spoke to him about this was, yeah, I gave that a fair flogging. And so his management of this paddock, it's essentially an annual pasture. So it's reverted to an annual pasture, so it's primarily subclover. He has put a couple of 100 kilos of superphosphate out per hectare in 3 of the 5 years, and he has cut, I can't remember how many cuts of subclover hay he actually took off it, but a lot. So there's been a massive removal of biomass from this paddock that is primarily an annual pasture. So one is dominated by perennial grasses. The blue one's dominated by perennial grasses. And I don't know if it has much of a legume component in it, but the red one is dominated by legumes, and they fix nitrogen. So it's actually increasing the soil fertility and probably increasing soil carbon at the same time. The interesting thing is that the management of these two paddocks is at opposite end of the spectrum. So there's a lot of, there are claims out there that, conservative grazing or well-managed grazing is the way that you change soil organic carbon or increase or sequester soil organic carbon, when in actual fact, that red line shows that it can happen when you flog a place. So there's something going on here that we need to unpick a bit more. It's also interesting to note that the site that's shown by the red line had the lowest starting value of all the sites. So it had the greatest capacity to increase its soil organic carbon through a management change. So that's probably had an impact on this result as well. So it's very contextual. So what we can actually draw from those graphs that I've shown is that even though previous research has demonstrated that management can result in a change in soil organic carbon, and that can be a decline through tillage, or it can be an increase or sequestration through moving to permanent pastures, those kind of things. In this study, the consistent trends that we observed in soil carbon change occurred in all sites regardless of management. So the role of management really wasn't a key factor in what happened here, from what we can understand. I am getting some more data from the producers, and we'll do a more in-depth analysis and see if we can actually tease out some of the factors. But at this stage, it makes us think, well, what about climate? What's the role of climate in determining, what we observed over this 10-year period? So what a colleague did was they got historic rainfall records, and they looked at what the rainfall intensity was in three categories: either a rainfall event of less than 5 mil, a rainfall event of between 5 and 25 mil, or a rainfall event of greater than 25 mils for all 4 seasons, so summer, winter, autumn and spring. And when you look at what happened in autumn, we have this increase and decrease for autumn, where rainfall intensity, or a rainfall event, was greater than 25 mils. And then if we look at winter, we have a similar up and down trend for rainfall intensity of, I guess, moderate rainfall intensity and high rainfall intensity. And so really this is suggesting that the driver here may be rainfall. However, we need to do some more stats and just try to get a better handle on it using some statistics, so we can have better confidence that was it. We've got an issue here with not many sites. So we need to actually just make sure that we're doing it the right way and we're doing it robustly. So the final part of my talk is about ACCU generation. So I don't want to dazzle people here with too much information, but I will step through each column here and just explain how it fits in with the ERF methodology. So the first column is what the soil organic carbon change was from the baseline between 2012 and 2017, what were recorded in 2017. In the ERF method, if you increase your emissions relative to the baseline, that actually gets subtracted from your soil carbon sequestration. So if you did something, if site 1 here did something to increase their greenhouse gas emissions from fertiliser or animals or electricity, the other sources of greenhouse gas emissions on farm, then they would have had a sequestration of 0. But in this instance, in all these instances, there wasn't an increase, so they didn't actually have a penalty. So the total sequestration was the same as the soil organic carbon change. Now, under the ERF method, you actually get discounted on the uncertainty of the estimates for a site between the 2 points. And so the fourth column there, or the fifth column, sorry, is the magnitude of the discount that occurred, because for 2 reasons actually. One is the spatial uncertainty in the estimate around the mean, and the other one is because it's the first sampling period, 25% of ACCUs are withheld in case there's a loss later on, so it acts as a bit of a buffer. And we can see that from a total sequestration for this site of 1766 tonnes, there was a discount of 768, which left 997 ACCUs for the entire site. Now, each site had a different area, so I've also put what the number of ACCUs generated per hectare were for these 4 sites. And I've picked these 4 sites out because they show different stories. So at $50 an ACCU, these are what the ACCUs were worth that were generated for those sites. And this doesn't include any sampling costs or any payment of ACCUs to an aggregator that comes in and manages a project for you. That is just, that's how many ACCUs you would have been generated, and that's what they're worth. So you need to subtract some costs from that. Now, when we look at the second period, this is where things start getting interesting. So site number 1 actually had a drop in soil organic carbon. And then there were minor increases overall, but what you need to see here is that this 70 here doesn't mean there was an increase, because the initial value was 1500. So they've actually lost most of their soil carbon. They're just down to 70 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent in soil. They're nearly at 0. Site 3 also lost a small amount of carbon, and site 4 actually increased it. But because of the way that it works, And again, I don't actually have this data yet, so I'm assuming there were no changes to greenhouse gas emissions. So there was actually no sequestration in any of these, but these two sites did have sequestration. And then what these discounts are, there was a discount of 84 ACCUs applied to site 4. What these brackets mean is that there was a 25% discount withheld in that first period, and because the soil organic carbon went down so much, they actually relinquished that discount. So that was held back. There wasn't an increase. Or it wasn't stable within that second sampling period. So they were never actually awarded to the project. When you look at what the ACCUs would, the number of ACCUs generated for the project were over that 10-year period, 3 of them were in negative, and there was only one, which is that red site, that actually had a positive number of ACCUs generated. When you look at what the value of those were, because you're in negative here, so there's actually a negative value attributed to that. If you had to replace these ACCUs at $50 a tonne, this is what it's going to cost. This one still gets money for that second sampling period, and that's your final position, excluding any sampling costs or excluding any payments of ACCUs to an aggregator that's managing the project for you. So there's if you're considering participating in an ERF project so that you can actually generate money, you need to be aware that it could end up having a negative cost. Now, people say that the government's never going to want their ACCUs back. I've heard that mentioned. Putting federal legislation is never a good way to make friends when you're doing a webinar, but there's nothing stopping them from actually getting projects to relinquish ACCUs when carbon is lost. And this applies to anything. It applies to any sequestration project, whether it's vegetation or soil. So this isn't the entire paragraph. I wasn't going to put everything in, but this kind of gives you an idea of what falls under Section 91 of the Carbon Farming Initiative Act when there's a reversal. So even if it's a natural disturbance, the reversal can be considered as something that relinquishment needs to happen. There's clauses in there about were reasonable steps taken to mitigate the effect of that natural disturbance, and that actually depends on your landscape management plan. No, I can't remember what it is, schedule that you have to prepare. But the key thing there is the bit in bold. The regulator may require the project proponent to relinquish a specified number of Australian carbon credit units when there is a reversal event. And when I've spoken to the people in the Department of Environment about this, they say the assessment will be done on a case-by-case basis. So it's not cut and dried. They're not actually willing to, at the point where we're at, talking hypothetically to say when it might happen, when it might not happen. But the legislation is written in such a way that it can happen if there is a reversal. So to summarise what I've spoken about today, even when you have a relatively low soil carbon starting point, because that's what we chose the CAMBI sites for, we knew that they had a decent capacity to sequester soil organic carbon because they had relatively low carbon stocks to begin with. Long-term sequestration isn't guaranteed even when you implement a management change, and it doesn't matter if you do a regenerative type approach or whether you're a high input farmer. Soil organic is lost, and I'm not saying can be lost here. Soil organic carbon is lost from agricultural soils as a result of seasonal conditions. There is no doubt about that. Okay, we know how it happens, and it happens because even when there is no plant growth putting carbon into the soil, the bugs in the soil are still using that carbon as an energy source, and they're still pumping things out. And what work at QUT has demonstrated is that one of the key drivers of soil carbon loss or soil organic carbon loss during droughts is when there's a pulse of rainfall that is enough to stimulate the microbes in the soil to start chewing through. They go, hey, this is great, we've got moisture, let's get on with our lives. And they start chewing through the soil organic matter, getting that carbon, respiring it, but there's no plant growth to go with it to actually put that in. And some of those pulses that they register when you have those rainfall events in a drought are 10 to 20 times baseline levels. They can be actually huge. Soil organic carbon changes that occur when you change management, whether it's sequestration or whether it's a loss, occur within the limitations posed by site-specific factors, so seasonal conditions and soil type. So if somebody gets a really good result and they've got, a beautiful red clay on their side of the fence, but the fence line goes down a boundary and their neighbour's got sandy soils, they can't expect to get the same result on their sandy soils, even though they're in that same location, And the same thing, you can't necessarily translate what happens on a red clay in, 100 kilometres away between two sites because they're going to be experiencing different seasonal conditions. So people need to keep that into account when they're thinking about soil organic carbon sequestration, particularly around trading it. Soil organic carbon is highly variable spatially as well as temporarily, so through time as well as across area, and that can make it difficult to detect change. And the best way to actually detect change is to make sure you've got an appropriate number of samples for whatever situation you're looking at so that you can detect the change that you hope to see from a management change. There's actually statistical analyses that can do that and can tell you what your sample number should be, that kind of thing. But you just need to keep in mind that variability is the enemy of somebody that actually wants to try and monetize soil organic carbon sequestration. The Australian government can force relinquishment of ACCUs. It's there, it's in the legislation. And if anything out of the Chubb review, it may actually that may change and it may become more rigorous with some of the comments that were made around, wasn't around additionality integrity. And my final point is that, based on everything I've said, that soil organic carbon trading or sequestering carbon to generate credits can be risky. There is a risk of having to return credits when you lose soil organic carbon. And there's also the risk, the economic risk around if you decide to make a management change, there's sampling costs, there's risk associated with making a management change and the cost of implementing that management change, only to have what happened in our trials here when there is actually no increase. So the final thing is that I'd just like to acknowledge the farmers that have helped us out with this work. Could not have done it without them, and it's actually been really enjoyable to work with the farmers that have helped us. It's been a great group of guys, and to have the engagement with them it's been a really good project. And just acknowledge that the results that I presented today, there would be well over 30 people that contributed to every part of it, whether it was farmer engagement, the economics, soil sampling, everything. It's actually been a huge team effort to get the results that we've got now. And hopefully we will be back in 3 or 4 years with more data and we can see what happens next time.